I now want to kind of shift gears just for a minute. So we're still in the US period of sort of 1912 to 1955. It's a territory now. It is not a state yet. There's a territorial governor. There's a territorial, essentially legislature assembly. You're going to want to remember that. There's a territorial both Senate and House. You're going to want to remember all those facts because they're going to be very relevant. So I want to talk now about something that parts of it were happening outside of Cook Inlet, parts of it were happening in Cook Inlet, but it's very, very relevant either way to this topic of how the American period progressed. So, if you will indulge me, this is a very important topic for us all to know about. You may or may not know about Elizabeth Petrovich Day. It celebrates Elizabeth Petrovich, who was one of the foremost advocates for an anti-discrimination bill in Alaska in 1945, which was actually the first really clear-cut anti-racial discrimination, or I should say kind of like equality in employment kind of law. It preceded the Civil Rights Acts of the 1960s. And so it's a really major, interesting part of Alaska that a lot of people don't know. So let's talk about it a little bit. At the time, there was rampant, maybe that's the wrong word, that suggests that everybody was doing it. There was widespread discrimination going on. It's been called the Jim Crow of Alaska. There were hotels where, in some of the major cities, such as Nome, where Native people were not allowed rooms. There were theaters, such as the Dream Theater in Nome, remember that one for a minute from now, where Native people had to either sit in the balcony or on the left side of the theater, rather in the more desirable right-hand side of the theater. There were restaurants where Native people weren't allowed or had to sit differently. There were pools that were segregated. There were churches that were segregated, church services where Alaska Native people couldn't go. There were also schools that were segregated, and so many of the schools at this point were federal schools under essentially the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and so they were run by the federal government, and they were often viewed as being of inferior quality to the white schools, but well, I shouldn't say just white schools, but the predominantly white schools run by the state instead. And the state's schools, some settlers strongly resisted having integration of Alaska Native people into the school systems. Partly, there was a variety of different arguments that were made. One argument, for example, was in an editorial, I think, and it's just terrible when you read it, but they were saying, that basically Alaska Native people would feel second class compared to people that had better like primary school, elementary school and stuff. So to integrate the high schools would be like a disservice to them. They would feel second class, and therefore they should be among other Alaska Native people, which is of course just the most like absurdly privileged argument, right? The answer to that would not be to not allow people into high schools. It would be to make sure that grade schools had the resources they needed in Native communities. But anyways, yeah, there was a lot of discrimination and segregation going on at the time. It wasn't, stuff like this, right? A restaurant with an all-white help sign. Or, Anchorage Grill had a sign that said, "We do not cater to Native and Filipino trade." So also discrimination against Filipino people. This, by the way, was owned by George Grames, who happened to be Greek American, and the governor of Alaska at the time saw that sign and came and encouraged him to take it down, and successfully. He basically said, how would you feel if I ran a restaurant and I said no Greek trade? And so George Grames was basically, well, I wouldn't feel very good at all about that. And so the governor of Alaska basically said, I view this as very un-American, and George Grames took the sign down. So, success story. The governor of Alaska at the time was a really interesting guy. We'll get to him in a minute. Elizabeth and Roy Petrovich were a married couple, two Tlingit people, and they were, Elizabeth was the president of what's called the Alaska Native Sisterhood. So there was two organizations, the Alaska Native Brotherhood and the Alaska Native Sisterhood. It was a fascinating group. They kind of grew out of some of the boarding schools in Southeast Alaska, in traditionally Tlingit territories, and so I believe some of the Presbyterian boarding schools in particular. So many of the people were Christian. Some of the people in A&B and ANS definitely supported assimilation and the idea of we need to give up old customs and sort of become integrated into the US, a sort of an assimilationist mindset, an integrationist mindset. But at the same time, they were also the foremost Native activists and advocates really at the time, and obviously were located very close to sort of the seat of power in Sitka, and were advocating, among other things, for the schools to be integrated, for no more of this sort of second-tier schools for Native kids, as well as for voting rights. So they were particularly, the Prachoviches were also particularly upset about and worked with these organizations on the issue of this discrimination, this segregation. So they were outside of a hotel that said no natives allowed, and this very much upset them. And so she wrote a letter to the governor, and she said, "Native boys are being called upon to defend our beloved country," right? This was written during World War II. There was what was called the Alaska Territorial Guard, which had overwhelmingly Alaska Native people in the military that were there to essentially also, in addition to the other military units, act as sort of a sentry, as sort of watch forces against Japanese intrusion into the area. So she says, Native boys are being called upon to defend our beloved country, right? This isn't sort of a rhetoric of down with the United States, but instead of the Elizabeth Petrovich, I think sincerely, very much use a rhetoric of and a framing of loving America and feeling like this was a betrayal of ideals. She says, just as the white boys, there's no distinction being made there, but yet when we try to patronize some business establishments, we are told in most cases that natives are not allowed. And she asked the governor to hopefully work on this issue, not just for Douglason, not just for, Sitka, Juneau, not just in Southeast Alaska, but throughout the state. And the governor did push for and introduce an anti-discrimination bill in 1943. Is stalled out at 8-8, which the governor actually took as like inspiring, given he was basically writes in his memoirs, given the like rampant racism at the time, he felt like 8-8 was actually surprisingly good. So the Alaska Native Brotherhood, the Alaska Native Sisterhood, fought against school discrimination. They also pushed for citizenship and voting rights. So Native people across the U.S. would not gain full universal citizenship in 1924. Some states had already allowed citizenship and voting rights, but it was not universal, and there was many areas in which they were disenfranchised. And so full citizenship would not happen until 1924, despite having been part of the United States, in the case of the Alaska Native people, for now essentially 60 years. During most of that time period, they had very limited political rights, particularly on voting. And so you had a strong push against Native voting, and then you had the A&B and ANS pushing for Native voting. You also just had a lot of people that weren't participating in the voting at that point, right? A lot of people who didn't really see the value in voting in this sort of settler colonial system. But anyways, you had a push around this time period to get Alaska Native people voting more and to make sure they had rights to vote. There was then a push back with literacy requirements. Basically, the people had to be literate to vote, because there would be like people would share like a stencil, like a cardboard cutout thing that would allow you to vote for like essentially what were viewed as like the pro-Alaska Native candidates. If you didn't know how to actually read the ballot, it would like allow you to like figure out which part of the sheet you're supposed to mark off on for people that couldn't read English. And so there was then the pushback from that with like a literacy requirement, which obviously would have disenfranchised a whole large chunk of Alaskan Native people at the time, although there was increasingly more and more literacy at that time. In the 1930s, you saw a boycott against a popular movie chain organized by the A&B and the ANS. They were just a really powerful group at the time. The A&B and the ANS, the Alaska Native Brotherhood and Sisterhood, were just very powerful. They could organize things like boycotts. They could take things to court about citizenship and voting rights. They were eventually able to get that, I think, struck down. And then, of course, eventually they were helped by the fact that in 1924 you had full citizenship. Eventually, they, along with allies, were able to get enough Alaska Native people voting and making sure that they were actually allowed to vote, that they were able to sweep into power 2 Tlingit legislators. At the time, the assembly was small enough, the legislative branch of the Territory of Alaska government was small enough that was major, right? So before, remember, it was 8-8, so sweeping in 2 Tlingit people meant suddenly Alaska Native people had 2 people more or less reliably on their side, at least from the perspective of the A and B, who could now tip the scales. And indeed, we'll talk in a minute that they eventually get the law passed just 1 year after these two Tlingit men get there. So, yeah, the power, right? The power of people getting politically involved. It's really kind of an inspiring story, especially when people are just being so sort of rampantly disenfranchised. But the pushback and the ability to do things, even things like, sort of writing campaigns and things that might not initially appear successful, but then were able to bear results. Quick segue before we keep talking about the battle against discrimination. The military kind of played an interesting role in the battle over discrimination in Alaska. So, as I said a minute ago, right, there was a huge influx of military people with the two forts that were established. There's also a context for why more and more troops are being sent up here. Not just that this part of the United States was very close to Japan, but it was at one point actively attacked. So 1942 was the Battle of Dutch Harbor, or we might say the bombing of Dutch Harbor, and then resistance by U.S. military forces. And then the occupation of the Unangan, or Aleut Islands of Attu and Kiska. The Battle of Attu took, my understanding is, like several months actually, as part of a broader Aleutian campaign to basically retake the Aleutian Islands, because you had a Japanese Empire presence on more than one island, and so it took months to reclaim them. And there was a sense of, let's get Aleut people from the federal government, let's get Aleut people away from what's going to become essentially a war zone. And so 900 Aleut people were evacuated to, in theory, protect them from the war zone, which I think was well motivated, certainly had good motivations. However, it was executed in a way that was extremely poor and damaging. Unfortunately, people were sort of housed in these canneries, abandoned canneries, that oftentimes had way too many people in a single abandoned cannery, as well as not like very good heating or insulation or anything. And so you had really unsanitary conditions, and there was quite a few deaths and illnesses of Aleut people in these canneries. It's a very sad part of Aleut history. Also, the people were not given advance notice in many cases that they were being evacuated, which is its own really problematic thing. And then in addition, you had some soldiers who looted villages, who looted Aleut villages, and so Aleut people came back to find villages looted. That really upset the governor, as well as some other people in the state government, and so that also contributed to why so many people were why there was starting to be momentum for an anti-discrimination bill. All right, well, here's another thing about that eventually kind of adds momentum. So the law doesn't pass, but there's definitely people that are wanting it. And then enter Alberta Shank. So Alberta Shank she's unfortunately passed a few years ago, but she was half Alaska Native, I think, in Inupiat, and half settler, I think, predominantly Irish American. So Alberta, though, she worked at the Dream Theater, the one that I told you about, that, like other theaters, had a very clearly demarcated Alaska Native section and then non-Alaska Native section. And she wrote to Marvin, colloquially known as Muktuk Marston, who was not himself Alaska Native, but he was sort of viewed by many as like an ally of Alaska Native people. He was a military leader at the time who was sort of pro-Alaska Native. That's in contrast with the head of the military forces in Alaska at the time, who was the son of a Confederate general and had very racist policies and would not allow Alaska Native women to serve in the USO, the supporting services, and favored discrimination and wouldn't allow white soldiers to fraternize with Alaska Native people, and thought that that would be terrible for the white soldiers. So you had like this military force guy who was like very very pro-discrimination, but then you also had this Marvin Muktuk Marston, who was also prominent at the time in the military forces in Alaska, and he was viewed as an ally of Alaska Native people. So settlers, quote unquote, or even the military, was not like some monolithic block, right? You had different people, especially as the conditions evolved, as people came to see the kind of injustices that were happening. You had people positioning themselves on different sides, even within settler bodies. So Alberta Shank, she did not like having to tell other Alaska Native people, hey, you have to sit in this section, right? Having to force discrimination on her own cultural relatives, right, her own peoples and closely related peoples. And she voiced that, and she was fired promptly from Dream Theater. And she wrote to Marvin Marston about it, and this military leader who's viewed as an ally. And he wrote back, and he was basically like, says in his memoirs, like, and I didn't try to sugarcoat it, right? I acknowledged how unjust that was. He said, she knew and I knew that here was a festering core of racial prejudice and social injustice. So she decides so he encourages her to write a letter to the editor of the Nome paper, and she does, and it is powerfully worded. She was like a junior in high school at the time, but is very powerfully worded. And she says, one of the things she says, what hurts us constantly is that we, Alaska Native people, are not able to go to a public theater and sit where we wish, but yet we pay the same price as anyone else, and our money is gladly received. Right? Just much like with the military argument, right? Our money is just as good. Our soldiers are just as good. And yet we get discriminated against. She also said that these policies of discrimination were following the steps of Hitlerism. So, obviously certain extent of things that were going on in Nazi Germany at the time had not fully come to light, but people were aware broadly, of course, of the rampant racism and genocide going on. And so that was often used, that was prompting certain people, like the governor of Alaska, to reflect on, okay, so we're fighting, the U.S. is fighting racism and genocide abroad, and yet in the U.S., right, have we kept our own streets? How does that old saying go? Kept our own streets swept, right? Have we, or do we have our own unresolved racial baggage? And the governor of Alaska came to the conclusion we very much do. And so he would tell people, like, this is Nazism, right? Like, this is like being a Nazi. This is like going in the path of Hitler. And Alberta Shank said the same thing. She said this is following in the steps of Hitlerism. So there was this rhetoric at the time that was sort of comparing it to Nazi policies. So Alberta goes on a date with a U.S. sergeant from the nearby military base, and they sit in the white section of the theater, and she refuses to leave, as does he. He's a white sergeant, but he, sort of in a show of solidarity with her, like, just keeps sitting right next to her, and she keeps sitting, and they eventually call the police in Nome, and they put her in jail overnight. And she sends a telegram to the governor, and the governor, who had been an ally in some ways at this point, was not pleased, and contacted the Nome mayor, who basically had to eat crow and say, he wrote a very terse letter back of just, a mistake was made, it will never happen again. And indeed, that mayor helped push forward legislation to stop discrimination. He helped introduce that into the legislature, actually. Okay, which then leads us, by the way, to Governor Groner. So, one other thing really quickly. Alberta Shank, by the way, the local military members ended up voting for her for, like, what was the name of it? It's not like Miss Nome, but it was something kind of equivalent to that. And they, different businesses had voting that you just go to the business and vote, and like military service members just like swamped the local businesses casting ballots for her in a show of solidarity to her after she was arrested. So there's like this really interesting dynamic where like the head of the Alaska military at the time is super discriminatory, and yet you have like a lot of local service people who are interacting with Alaska Native people and did not like the discrimination they were seeing and like came out in support of Alberta Shank. So is this major like activism motivation, and it inspired these kind of like public shows of defiance. Another example is that after she got arrested, there was a bunch of other Alaska Native people who bought tickets to the theater and then went and refused to move from their seats, right? Far more than could be removed. And so you have this like strong pushback. Around this time, you also have Governor Groner. I think he's from Washington of all places, but I'm not 100% sure. But he was appointed by FDR, became the governor of the territory of Alaska. Again, he compared the discrimination. When he came here, he was very surprised by it, and he compared it to Nazism. He noted that there was Alaska Native military involvement, the Territorial Guard, and he very much was opposed to the discrimination. He was opposed sometimes, again, by Simon Bolivar Buckner, who was that guy who was the son of the Confederate general who wouldn't even allow Alaska Native people into the U.S. So Governor Groner pushed back on that strongly. He also wrote to Alberta Shank, very much agreed with her position, and he said, "The discrimination is very objectionable to me. I consider it un-American. I feel that it violates the principles upon which our nations are founded. I deem it contrary to the spirit of our country and directly in conflict with the issues on which this great war is being fought. In this war, American boys of all races and creeds are enlisted. There is no discrimination when they are called upon to lay down their lives for their country and for liberty." So patriotism became sort of a rallying call of anti-discrimination. People were not sort of pushing for anti-discrimination on the grounds of sort of get America out so much as make America act the way it claims to be acting and the way that our young men in our communities are fighting and dying for. So this eventually, they try to pass the law again, the anti-discrimination law in 1945, and Roy and Elizabeth Petrovich both give testimonies. In Roy Petrovich's testimony, he makes what many people at the time regarded as a carefully worded threat. He said, "We have opposed reservations. We want to take our chances with the white man." So he says basically, there are people in the federal government who want to set up reservations because they'd been making, some Alaska Native people, particularly in the Klinga area, had been making land claims and basically taking this to court and saying, like, listen, like, this was never conceded by treaty, this still technically belongs to us, we deserve financial compensation or some other kind of compensation, or better yet, our land's back. So the land claim issue was being pushed at the time. And Roy Petrovich basically said, so far we have not wanted to adopt reservations like a lot of people in the lower 48. We wanted to take our chances with sort of trusting and integrating with broader Alaskan society, but the implication was we might not always do that because the reservation system was viewed by many Alaska politicians at the time as, oh, that would be a disaster because like that would be huge chunks of land that would potentially be closed off from resource development and from state lands and from homesteading and things like that. So Roy Petrovich makes kind of an implicit threat of sort of, if you want us to be involved in your new state, or what was becoming a state was not yet formally a state, you ought to also respect us as members of it. Nonetheless, despite that kind of a testimony, there were still legislators in the Senate and the House that were pushing back against it. For example, you had people arguing that, quote, Eskimos were not an inferior race, but an individual race that needed time to catch up to white civilization. So this idea that Alaska Native people were not ready to be integrated. Others argued that this was a cultural problem that was eventually solving itself over time and that the laws would not help that at all, that the laws could not end the cultural attitude of racism, that only additional time could. You'll note that that's a similar argument to what people lobbed at Martin Luther King Jr., which is why in one of his famous addresses he says, the I'm not quoting him exactly, but time fixes nothing, time is neutral. Right? It matters what we do with it. Time doesn't automatically mean more justice will happen, just giving things time. And so it's a similar kind of thing with saying here. People are saying, well, give it time, it's fixing itself, we don't need a law, and the law can't make people not be racist, which Elizabeth Petrovich then gave testimony. And in her testimony, it was apparently incredibly moving, and people at the time regarded it as like this was the testimony that ended up like securing key swing votes and getting this law passed. And one of the things she said in the testimony was, do your laws against larceny and even murder prevent those crimes? She said basically, yeah, like the law's not going to entirely prevent racism, the laws don't entirely prevent murder, but we still pass laws about murder, right? It's still the right thing to do to have laws against it. After she closed her address, there was a standing ovation from the audience, followed by silence, followed by the passing of the Alaska Equal Rights Act, the first Equal Rights Act in America. Did it end discrimination in the United States or in Alaska? Of course not. Did it end many of the more overt forms of discrimination and segregation at the time? And was it a huge step forward? Most definitely. It was a major step forward. Very important law banning things like separate sections of movie theaters or hotels not allowing Alaska Native residency, or the sort of housing discrimination that was going on at the time. So major step forward. I just will briefly now talk about the sort of fourth phase now of the U.S. period. We then have the shift to statehood. There was people both for and against adopting. So there was for several decades people wanting to become a state. Part of this, people like Governor Groner were wanting statehood because they felt like it would give them more power against outside commercial interests. So there was fishing and mining groups, as we've talked about, who were up in Alaska from the lower 48, doing things like setting up big fish traps, right, and making it so that they got all the fish that came up the river and depleting the fish population. Some people will say that those fears were oversold. I'm not sure one way or the other, but it's clear that some people felt like those fish traps were a major problem, that the canneries were a major problem, and that some of the mining was a major problem, and that they wanted more of sort of legal control over the land, which would require them to be a state and have elected representatives to the U.S. And so that there was people pushing it. There was also people resisting it. And then statehood, though, definitely accelerated in 1957 with the discovery right here on the peninsula of oil at Swanson River. Of course, a much more minor. And so oil activities start around that time period in Cook Inlet area. We start to get both on and offshore oil drilling eventually. And then in 1959, the adoption of the Alaska as a state. Now, when Alaska was adopted as a state, we'll talk about this a lot more next week, but to kind of preview it, the Alaska Act, the act that established Alaska in the U.S. Congress, was written in such a way that it implied / suggested / overtly said that Alaska Native lands that were not already sort of ceded, were not already sort of given to other parties, that remaining Alaska Native lands would be decided by Congress. And yet, in the sort of oil rush and different things, and just in general, the new statehood, you had Alaska Native lands increasingly being infringed upon, and then you had Alaska Native groups that were pushing for their own land claims. People in Tlingit territory, people Inupiat people claiming large chunks, for example, of North Slope, which of course became very controversial because of the 1968 North Slope oil recovery. People claiming large parts and saying that's still native land. We still live there. This has never really been settler land. There's not really a settler presence in big chunks. Were huge chunks of Alaska that there wasn't really a settler presence at that point. And so this was taken to the Claims Commission Court, which we'll talk about a little bit next week, and it ended up resulting in what was essentially a land freeze, where the federal government said, until this stuff gets sorted out, you cannot develop the North Slope lands and build the pipeline that you want to build to do oil exploration. State of Alaska, which eventually put on pressure to eventually come to a settlement, which was the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, which changed the face of Alaska Native affairs in this state really forever. So we'll talk about that more next week.